Hi, I'm Scott Ritter, and what you're being told about this war is not the full story, because behind the headlines, behind the dramatic statements, behind the claims of decisive strikes and game-changing weapons, something very different is actually happening, and if you're not paying attention to the details, you're going to miss it completely. There's a moment in every conflict where one side believes it has finally gained the upper hand, a moment where new technology, new weapons, or new tactics create the illusion of control. And right now, many are saying that moment belongs to the United States, a so-called secret weapon, a capability that supposedly shifts the balance overnight. But here's the reality. In modern warfare, there is no such thing as a single weapon that decides everything. There are only systems, systems of intelligence, systems of logistics, systems of strategy, and unless all of those systems align perfectly, even the most advanced weapon becomes just another tool, powerful, yes, but limited. So when people hear that the United States has deployed something new, something secret, something that Iran didn't expect, the immediate reaction is predictable: shock, speculation, and the assumption that the other side is now on the defensive. But that assumption is where most people get it wrong, because Iran is not operating in this conflict the way people think it is. It's not reacting emotionally, it's not panicking, it's calculating, carefully, deliberately, and more importantly, it has been preparing for this kind of moment for years. You have to understand how Iran approaches conflict. It doesn't rely on overwhelming force in the traditional sense. It relies on layered defense, asymmetric response, and strategic patience. It builds redundancy into its systems. It disperses critical assets. It assumes that any fixed target will eventually be hit and plans accordingly. So when a new weapon is introduced, the question is not can it strike? The question is what does it actually change? And that's where the gap between perception and reality becomes obvious, because even in cases where the United States has deployed its most advanced capabilities, precision-guided munitions, stealth systems, long-range strike platforms, the actual strategic impact has often been far more limited than the headlines suggest. Infrastructure can be damaged, facilities can be delayed, but knowledge, experience, and distributed capability, those are much harder to eliminate, and Iran understands that. That's why its strategy is not built around avoiding every strike. It's built around surviving them, absorbing them, and continuing to operate despite them. So when reports emerge of a secret weapon being used, Iran's response is not panic, it's assessment. What was used? What did it hit? What was the actual damage? And most importantly, what does it reveal? Because every new weapon tells a story, not just about capability, but about intention, about priorities, about what the other side is willing to risk, and that information is valuable, sometimes more valuable than the damage itself. This is where the dynamic becomes more complex than most people realize. Because while one side is demonstrating power, the other side is learning from it, adapting, adjusting, preparing for the next move, and in a conflict like this, adaptation is everything. Now let's talk about the idea of panic. Panic is emotional, it's reactive, it leads to mistakes, and in high-level military strategy, mistakes are what decide outcomes. But there is very little evidence that Iran is operating in that way. In fact, if you look at the broader pattern, you see something very different. You see restraint, you see measured responses, you see a willingness to escalate but only within controlled limits, and that tells you something important. It tells you that the objective is not immediate retaliation at any cost, it's long-term positioning. Because this conflict is not being fought for a single moment, it's being fought for the outcome that comes after all of this, and that outcome is shaped by endurance, not just firepower. This is why even analysts who are critical of U.S. strategy, like me, have repeatedly pointed out that these kinds of strikes, no matter how advanced the weapons involved, do not automatically translate into strategic victory. In some cases, they can even have the opposite effect. They can reinforce the opponent's narrative. They can justify further escalation. They can push the conflict into a phase where control becomes harder to maintain, and once control starts slipping, the risks increase dramatically. That's the real danger here, not the weapon itself, but what happens next, because every action triggers a reaction, and in a tightly balanced environment like this, reactions can escalate faster than anyone intends. So instead of asking whether Iran is panicking, the better question is this: how is Iran adjusting? What is it learning? And what is it preparing to do next? Because those answers will tell you far more about where this is heading than any headline about a secret weapon.